Our topic tonight, Native Americans and the United States Constitution, is one of controversy. We may not solve the controversy tonight, but we hope to learn a little bit more about the problem. Long before European settlers stepped foot in the New World, Indian natives had built thriving civilizations here with their own culture, customs, and government. 300 years later, when the Founding Fathers set about to establish their own government, some of the concepts and principles seemed oddly similar to those in the Great Law of Peace already in practice by the Iroquois Confederacy over 600 years before. Did our Founding Fathers, many of whom had close contacts with the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee, did they use the same principles in establishing their Constitution? Scholars have been debating this for years, even though in 1988, the year of the bicentennial of the ratification of the United States Constitution, the Congress passed a resolution recognizing the Native American contribution to the United States Constitution. That, however, has not stopped the controversy. Tonight, our speaker, Professor Christina Ayne Crouch, will try to shed some light on this issue. Dr. Crouch is an associate professor of historical studies and director of American Studies at Bard College. In addition to her responsibilities at Bard, she's written her first book on early North America, titled Nobility Lost: French and Canadian Martial Cultures, Indians, and the End of New France, for which she received the 2015 Mary Alice and Philip Bossier Award. She is currently writing Queen Victoria's Captives, A Story of Ambition, Empire, and a Stolen Ethiopian Prince. She is a member of Alejandro Institute Council and has numerous fellowships. So please welcome Dr. Crouch.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, a little louder? All right. Better. Okay, good. Well, I want to thank Sue for inviting me to participate in the Fireside Chats, and I would like to thank everybody who came out on a particularly blustery March night to come and hear this talk. And I also have another thank you, a land acknowledgement for the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians, because I recognize that I am a guest on the homelands of their territory. Recognition is an important step in ensuring that I, as a scholar, do not participate in the continued erasure of descendant communities in this place or in areas to which they have been removed. And acknowledgement is also a way to acknowledge that all of my historical research must be undertaken with an eye to multiple constituencies, to Native communities, to the scholarly community, and to the broader community, like all of you, in which I find myself. When Sue first contacted me about doing the Fireside Chat, she had proposed that I undertake an exploration of the topic of American Indian influence in the United States Constitution, as you heard. And initially when she proposed this, I ran the other direction and said, absolutely not. There is no way I am taking this on. There must be at least 40 articles on this. And so we figured out a way to kind of get around this. And so what I'm going to be talking to you tonight about is rooted in her initial proposal, but expanded to think about how this subject can provide us with new questions, new perspectives on familiar histories, and offer the possibility for greater inclusivity in the stories that we tell and the pasts that we remember. So next slide. This is our hack for tonight. We're very proud of ourselves for this. So hopefully everyone can see this. If you, too fast. No, one before that. One before that. Amazing. For those who are in the room on this side, you're very lucky you actually have the contemporary flag that you can look at as well. So this belt that you're looking at, which is made of onigol, or wampum, quahog shells, and channeled whelk, from Long Island Sound, is popularly known as the Hiawatha Belt. And this belt is reputedly the oldest belt that exists within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's also the basis of the modern Haudenosaunee flag. And it is a visual representation of that confederacy. The 5 nations who claimed the region that spans from what is currently the province of Quebec through northern, central, and western New York into the province of Ontario. Each nation occupies a place on this belt. As I said, this has been adapted into the modern Haudenosaunee flag. And so as you look at this belt moving from left to right, left, the box at the very edge represents the Seneca Nation, the keepers of the western door. Next to that, a box to represent the Cayuga Nation. That central tree-like, oh, thank you. I don't think I've ever used one of these before, but look at that. There we go. That central tree there is a representation of the Onondaga Nation, the keepers of the central fire, to the next one, which is the Oneida Nation, and finally, representing the keepers of the eastern door, the Mohawk Nation. And just to give you a note on the terms that I'm using, I'm going to talk about Haudenosaunee tonight. Literally, Haudenosaunee means the people of the Longhouse. And I'm using this rather than the more familiar term of Iroquois or Iroquois, because Haudenosaunee is what the Confederacy calls itself. It's also because the word Iroquois has a very different lineage. It's derived from an Algonquian word that means the greater snakes. And this is what Algonquians who were suffering from a period of Haudenosaunee expansion called their neighbors. Desesu was what they called the lesser snakes, who became the nations that we now call the Sioux in the West. The Confederacy, I should add today, also includes the Tuscarora Nation, so it's 6 and not 5, although that's not represented on this belt. And this is because the Hiawatha Belt predates that movement. So the Tuscaroras left the Carolinas in the 1720s in the wake of colonial wars and moved north to join the Haudenosaunee and are now part of the Confederacy. Now, within the Confederacy, you may be familiar with this group here, the Oneida Nation. They're located in what's currently the central New York region. During the American Revolution, many Oneidas supported the efforts of rebelling settler colonists against Great Britain, and this is a subject of considerable pride for a number of current community members. So next slide. Perfect. What you are looking at is a portrait of a man named Atiotaharangwen, who was also known as Colonel Louis Cook, or simply as Colonel Louis. Colonel Louis was born to an Abenaki mother and an African-American father in the vicinity of Saratoga Springs, and he was taken captive as a young child during a raid in King George's War, or the War of Austrian Succession, in the 1740s. The French wanted to sell the child into slavery, but his Abenaki mother argued for his adoption into a native community, and so he was adopted by Mohawks and raised at Ganawage, which is on the St. Lawrence River. From that time, he served in the 7 Years' War and then later in the Revolution, and he has the distinction of being the highest commissioned officer in the Continental Army. For Native Americans and the only African-American commissioned officer in the Continental Army. So he was given the post of lieutenant colonel in 1779. And the sketch that you're looking at here is a sketch that was made by John Trumbull, who painted many of the founding fathers. This is a sketch made in preparation for his masterpiece, The Death of General Montgomery at the Attack of Quebec, so General Montgomery from our local Montgomery Place. Made in 1785 from life. Now, beyond material and military support, and I should add, I'm showing you Louis Cook not because he was adopted by the Oneidas, but because he led Oneidas in the American Revolution when the Oneida Nation supported the rebelling colonists. Beyond material and military support, Oneidas have also lobbied for greater recognitions of issues that impact contemporary Native communities today. And so if you have heard of the Oneidas, it's likely not necessarily because of their role as supporters of the American Revolution, but because they engage in a tremendous amount of advocacy, particularly around the issue of Indian mascots. So the Oneida Nation supported efforts to have the name of the Washington football team changed. They've also supported efforts to have Indian mascots taken off of high schools. And they have also housed the only widespread Native media resource, Indian Country Today Network, which is now housed on the grounds of the Oneida Nation. Oneida advocacy work has also extended to an acknowledgement of the role of the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, in the confederated ideas of the U.S. Republic and the U.S. Constitution. So next slide. This sculpture, made by a Utah-based artist, is now on the 4th floor of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. The sculpture was a gift of the Oneida Nation. It's a slightly larger than life-size bronze, and it represents Chief Shenandoah, Polly Cooper, both of them Oneida figures who were essential to helping American troops during the Revolution and afterwards, and George Washington. And you'll notice, if you ever have a chance to go to Washington, please go and see the sculpture. It has much more detail than is rendered in the slide, but you'll notice that you see representations of different Oneida clans, like the Wolf clan and the Bear clan here. They're standing on the back of a great turtle, literally the Turtle Island, which is what the Haudenosaunee call the United States and North America. And behind them is a representation of the white pine, or the Great Tree of Peace, which is exactly this same image from the central portion of the Hiawatha Belt. Now, I chose this image because it is representative of relationships built between and among Native communities and Anglo-Americans. And it very much emphasizes the exchanges from indigenous culture to the United States. And this is really where the discussion about Native influence on the Constitution comes from, that it's particularly a Haudenosaunee influence, not a sort of general Native American influence, and that the Oneidas have been really in the forefront of keeping this in the public mind. The question of Indian influence on the U.S. Constitution can be a thorny one, and it has been a topic of debate among scholars for the last 30 years, but the actual issue was raised well before that. What we now call the Iroquois influence thesis dates back to the late 19th century. Next slide, please. To this work, where you see the frontispiece and title page of The League of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, by Lewis Henry Morgan, an anthropologist working in New York in the 19th century. Morgan undertook the work of writing a history of the Haudenosaunee through fieldwork, but also through a series of dialogues with Native interlocutors, including the influential Seneca Parker family. And I've included an image here of an individual who might be recognizable to some people here. Anybody know who this is? Besides the fact that it's labeled Eli S. Parker? Eli S. Parker served in the Civil War on the staff of Ulysses S. Grant and was the individual who was charged with receiving Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. So he is a Seneca. He was a Seneca chief. He later becomes the first commissioner in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, presiding over Grant's peace policy during the Grant presidency. But Parker's family was well-connected, really keepers of knowledge for the Seneca community. And Morgan spent a great deal of time speaking with the Parkers in building this narrative. And Morgan noted in an 1899 publication, quote, "It is worthy of remembrance that the Iroquois commended to our forefathers a union of the colonies similar to their own as early as 1755. And so we could actually say that Morgan is the first person to really kind of publicize this notion of the Iroquois influence thesis. Morgan's idea was widely popularized by the 1982 books, The Iroquois and the Founding of the American Nation by Donald Grin Jr., and 1991's Exemplar of Liberty, Native America and the Evolution of Democracy by Grind and Bruce Johansson. And their thesis can basically be roughly summed up as follows. The Confederation model of the Six Nations inspired American political thinkers to conceptualize a strong union over a fractious and disparate group of colonies. And these gained a lot of traction in the 1980s. And in 1987, as Sue mentioned, on the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution, Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii introduced a resolution to, quote, acknowledge the contribution of the Iroquois Confederacy of Nations to the development of the United States Constitution. And the Senate and later the House passed this joint resolution that October. The work by individuals like Johanson and Grind and others forwarding the influence thesis rested on intriguing elements derived from the colonial archival record, both from native orators and from influential colonial figures, and they used these to suggest a link between Confederation and government. And I think this is in the next slide. Nope, not the next slide. I might have left this one out. So two of the most cited examples that scholars arguing for the Iroquois influence thesis were taken from the 1744 Lancaster Treaty. So the Lancaster Treaty takes place between Pennsylvania colony of the Oneida Nation website, and they have the preamble of the Constitution and then basically state that the Haudenosaunee had come up with the notions of indissoluble union 250 years earlier. And then they pair it, interestingly enough, with an image of this treaty taken from the 1790s. So the treaty that the Oneidas signed with the United States government. Now remember that the Oneidas support the American Revolution and benefit in some sense from the American Revolution because of their service, are able to advocate for retaining their lands. So there's a real interest in kind of tying this legacy to that of the Constitution. This perspective that Franklin and Gonzadego put forward, but particularly Franklin, about thinking about political governance and sovereignty among Native nations, was also reinforced by other authors in the 18th century. Next slide, please. Writing about the Haudenosaunee in 1747 in his History of the Five Indian Nations, Cadwallader Colden had described the individual Haudenosaunee nations, these are the quotes that I had earlier, as, quote, an absolute republic by itself. So he's really reinforcing with the statement that there is a recognizable government structure and sovereignty among the Haudenosaunee. Next slide, please. So here you have Cadwallader Colden, painted by the American artist Matthew Pratt. And Cornell University Press has recently reissued an edition of Colden's History of the Five Indian Nations. And it's a really interesting exercise to think about people writing a history of the five nations in the 18th century when they're seen as sovereign and outside of the bounds of the state, versus Morgan writing in the mid-19th century when all of his territory has come under U.S. jurisdiction and the jurisdiction of New York State, and thinking about what that history means. Proponents of the Iroquois influence thesis also cited Thomas Jefferson's admiration for the ideas of John Locke on property. But Jefferson didn't simply admire Locke's notions of property. He also greatly admired Locke's propositions regarding disinterestedness or public virtue. And one of the things that never ceases to strike me when I'm at Bard is when I bring up disinterestedness in class, my students assume that it means that they're bored. Like, no, the Founding Fathers were not bored. It's very much derived from the notion of putting the public good above the individual good. And this is really the principle that governs the early republic. Virtue is at the heart of this, which is why Benedict Arnold's treason was so scandalous. It wasn't just that he betrayed the Continental Army and the sort of fledgling republic. It's that he did it for personal gain. He did it for title. He did it for money. He didn't do it for a bigger cause than that. So Jefferson's focus on disinterestedness or public virtue also seemed to appear in Jefferson's writings when he showed an interest in the communal nature of Indian governance. the way in which he interpreted Indian governments to have a reliance on the laws of nature and an emphasis on the public good above the self. So it seems like a pretty compelling case. You have Franklin, who's making the statement about the Haudenosaunee and their influence on government in a sort of backhanded compliment. You have Ganazadego invoking Indian unity as a means for the colonies to sort of sort out their problems. And you have Jefferson, who obviously is a central figure in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and later in the Constitutional Convention, really forwarding this notion of Indians as essential to the Republic. And yet, a number of scholars have rejected the Iroquois influence thesis. The first rejections came from scholars uninterested in engaging with the deep political and philosophical traditions of Native communities. And many of these scholars pointed to the Articles of Confederation, which had preceded the Constitution, and argued that the Articles of Confederation can be read as coming exclusively from the English tradition of the 17th century, the inspiration for reform that had shaped the era after the English Civil Wars and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And so for individuals who really adhered to the notion of English inspiration of American republicanism, or even antiquity, for instance, Plato's Republic as the driving force, they simply saw no relationship between Native peoples and the founding of the American documentary record. Other scholars attacked the Iroquois influence thesis by looking at the original draft of the Constitution, which, I don't know how recently you've looked at the Constitution or not, but it contains only 2 references to Indians, and I think this might be the next slide. Indeed it is. So here are the 2 clauses of the Constitution. The first, which references congressional power in Article 1, Section 8, is to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And the second has to do with representation and refers to Indians, not taxed. So basically, if you are not taxed, you cannot participate in representative government. And so what you see in these 2 statements is that Indians are firmly placed outside of the body politic and very much placed in the realm of sovereign foreign nations. Thus, only the federal government has the right to treat with Indian nations, to make treaties with Indian nations, and also that they're not taxed and therefore not citizens. With the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, so a century later, and the extension of U.S. citizenship to 4 million newly freed African Americans, the Constitution and its amendment once again explicitly excluded Native peoples as being members of sovereign nations outside of the boundaries of the United States. And this question of citizenship and inclusion wasn't resolved until the passage of the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. So this lasts a long time that they're being defined outside of the body politic. Now, another compelling point that scholars looking at the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights pointed to was the ways in which Native peoples had been characterized, particularly in the Declaration of Independence. And this is to kind of speak to this notion of Jefferson's admiration for Indians, because in the Declaration of Independence, they were explicitly characterized as quote-unquote merciless savages, and as clear enemies of the fledgling polity emerging out of the 13 colonies. So what the Constitution effectively reinforced was the concept of defining Indians as outside of and foreign to the United States. And given this grounds, and also this notion of Indians constituting a very threat to the colonies, it seems somewhat surprising that someone would want to make the argument that Indians were therefore the quintessential influence on the foundational document, the Constitution. Now, beyond the Constitution itself, scholars also took issue with other parts of the influence thesis. Next slide, please. For some scholars, one of the problems with the influence thesis lay in the later Indian policy of many of the framers. And if you think about the hallmarks of Jefferson's presidency, particularly in his second term, Jefferson envisioned a republic of yeoman farmers. And in the second inaugural, he brings up this idea of an empire for liberty. Well, the way that you get land for a republic of yeoman farmers and an empire for liberty is by moving west through something like the Louisiana Purchase, which is the claiming of native space and native land. Jefferson envisioned an absorption of Indians into the American body politic, but only if they assimilated. For all of Jefferson's admiration, here's one of his quotations from this period, speaking to Native communities: "Give up the deer and the buffalo and cultivate the earth," meaning take up farming. "You will find our laws good for this purpose. You will wish to live under them. You will unite yourselves with us, join in our great councils, and form one people with us." So this seems to explicitly argue against Native peoples as the inspiration for the Constitution, if Jefferson is then turning around and saying, we have perfected the idea of a republic, and for you to participate in this means leaving aside your traditional life ways and becoming assimilated into America. His policies as president accelerated the process of assimilation as the only acceptable method for Indians to remain part of and identifiable as equals to the United States. And so what Jefferson advocates for is the strategy that's taken up by the group that came to be called the Five Civilized Tribes: the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles. The Cherokees go so far as to write their own constitution in 1827, ratified by the Cherokee Council, and it is almost word for word a copy of the U.S.Constitution. And they're doing this in part to create a documentary record, as every sovereign nation was expected to have, but they're also doing this, it's a smart strategy if you think about it. If you use the U.S.Constitution as your inspiration, then it's going to be really hard for American politicians to say it's an invalid document, right? Because you're literally going to be saying, well, you copied our Constitution, that's not a good idea. And ultimately, this strategy works until the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who is utterly committed to the notion of Indian removal in the 1830s. Anthropologist Elizabeth Tooker also rejected the Iroquois influence thesis, and her rejection had nothing to do with the archival record, but instead rested on the idea that the Iroquois influence thesis was mischaracterizing Haudenosaunee tradition and culture. So Tooker's ethnographic work had been with Haudenosaunee communities throughout New York and Canada, and her point was that this was simply a sort of misrepresentation of, women's rights before the 1970s. Iroquois matriarchs were not feminists waiting for the civil rights movement and women's rights movement, and that to paint them as such was to do a disservice to the culture. Other historians undertook a systematic investigation of the sources that Grind and Johansen had used, looking at them in full rather than in extract, and comparing this to the record of the Founding Fathers on issues pertaining to Native communities. And some of the most damning evidence against these 1980s, 1990s works arguing for the Iroquois influence thesis was that they had literally changed some of the quotations from Franklin, from Gonzadego, from Adams, and from Madison, and really used extremely thin evidence to make this argument. Even beyond the question of language were the direct actions of Americans that had shaped the realities for Native peoples from the 1770s through the 1790s and beyond. And in some sense, what the Iroquois influence thesis does is it erases the relationship in the era of the American Revolution and its aftermath. So I'm going to sketch a little bit of that out here. The American Revolution has been characterized correctly, I think, as a series of revolutions and also as a series of civil wars. The campaign led by General John Sullivan and the Continental Army into the heart of Seneca Territory in western New York in 1778 can be described as nothing short of a genocidal, scorched earth approach to break the backbone of Native defense of their homelands. Under George Washington's orders, many in Sullivan's forces participated in an extraordinary level of violence that targeted in particular sites of subsistence, cornfields, centuries-old orchards, and winter food stores that had been laid aside in order to guarantee that the Senecas would experience a starving winter. And the winter of 1778-1779 was considered to be particularly harsh. Many among Sullivan's armies, in their personal records, journals, and letters, literally described this violence in gendered terms. And this was in no small part because the cultivation work in Haudenosaunee society was undertaken by women, by girls. Thus, to attack the bounty of Western New York and Seneca territory, which many soldiers also noted was literally some of the richest earth they had ever seen in their lives. This is an incredibly agriculturally productive region. Attacking this bounty was to attack the bodies of the women. And to attack the women, I would argue, was to attack subsequent generations, because the women were the source of the very reproduction of the community, reproduction of knowledge, reproduction of lifeways. I mean, think about women embodying both productive labor in the work that they're doing and reproductive labor in the generations that come after them. Now, the Sullivan Campaign did not destroy the Haudenosaunee, but it did bring a great deal of suffering and made thousands into refugees. And this is reflected in speeches from the early 1790s when the Seneca chief corn planter and other Senecas encountered federal officials. And they were very clear when they stated to George Washington that his name in their community was Town Destroyer. And Corn Planter said that when Town Destroyer's name was heard, the women feared and the children clung to the necks of their mothers. And what's interesting about this is Washington was not simply named Town Destroyer by the Senecas. This was a moniker that had been given to his grandfather in Virginia in the 17th century. So there's a long legacy in the Washington family of doing this. So given this history, celebrating the particularly Haudenosaunee roots of Confederation and constitutional thought by the very individuals who enacted this violence seems somewhat disjointed. For me, rather than engaging in an endless debate about definitive proof of influence or not, is, to a certain extent, not really the question we should be asking. Instead, we might think about what is at stake in claiming native roots for the U.S. Constitution. On the most negative side, claiming native roots for the Constitution serves to naturalize the rights of non-native peoples to territorial acquisition. And it cements native communities as an important part of the American past, but not a part of the American present and future. And in this notion of past and future, I'm borrowing work done by the scholar Jeannie O'Brien Kehoe on what she calls the trend of firsting and lasting, a trend that has been particularly rampant in New England and the Mid-Atlantic for the last 150 years or more. The basic framework of Jeannie's argument is that in the 19th century especially, Anglo-Americans began working to be visibly recognized as the first step at Plymouth, the first settlement west of the Connecticut River, the first English child born in the Hudson Valley, for instance. So each one of these is a first. At the same time that all of this firsting was taking place, authors, educators, and public celebrations and events emphasized the last pertaining to Indians. And so the image that I put up here is an image of James Fenimore Cooper's 1826 novel, The Last of the Mohicans. I love this because I love the illustrations by N.C. Wyeth. This is an edition from the early 20th century. And I'll explain why I have this image up in a moment. But Cooper's Last of the Mohicans exemplified the trend that was repeated in numerous editorials and features in local publications that noted the passing of the last native speaker of any given native language, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, what have you. Or worst yet, the passing of the quote-unquote last full-blooded individual of any particular nation. And this is actually something that if you do a quick Google search, or in your own lifetimes, I'm sure you've seen that local publications will often make mention of this. Taken together, firsting and lasting naturalized settler colonial claims to space and mobilized Native history and Native peoples in the service of a U.S. project that erased their contemporary presences and claims. The lasting project in particular opened the door for states to literally dissolve communities. Rhode Island, for instance, did this with the Narragansetts in the late 19th and early 20th century, basically stating, if there are no Narragansett speakers and no quote-unquote full-blooded Narragansetts, there simply cannot be a Narragansett nation, so we legislate it out of existence. The combination of dissolution and the emphasis on blood quantum percentage, so this literally means how much blood do you need to be considered an Indian, made it extraordinarily challenging for descendants to be able to seek federal recognition in the era of the Red Power movement in the 1970s and beyond. And this is actually something that has come back with a vengeance. Currently, the Mashpee Nation in Massachusetts is being threatened with detribalization on the basis of blood quantum percentage. And the reason that I chose this image of N.C. Wyeth's illustrated Last of the Mohicans is, if you ever saw the 1992 Michael Mann movie, The Last of the Mohicans, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, what's interesting is the cinematography for that movie, which is beautiful, is literally taken from Wyeth's illustrations. So if you ever read this book as a child or an adult, I read it as a child, and you saw the movie, it reinforced this perspective of lone Indian sort of moving away with the natural landscape behind him. He's all by himself. He is the last of his kind. Stopping at Joint House Resolutions 331 and 332, these are the resolutions from 1987 or 88 that recognized Indian influence, was a first step, but it also sidestepped the issue of recognizing responsibilities and enduring issues that impact Native communities today in their relationship to the United States. Next slide, please. Beyond this, there's a consideration of how Native philosophy, government, and organization actually diverge from the US system. And in some sense, I think this is where the influence thesis becomes really interesting in what it doesn't show us. Fundamentally, the grounds for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are based on the principles of John Locke, not the Haudenosaunee. For John Locke, this was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And I think property is a good stand-in for happiness here. Locke wrote the second treatise on government in the late 17th century. Locke also penned the Constitution for Carolina Colony that grounded the principles that English individuals used to dispossess Native peoples. And Locke's basic principle is that the only thing you own in this life is your body. If you mix your labor with unclaimed soil, you make that your own. So your labor plus improvement on the land gives you a right to claim that land. And so if Native peoples weren't improving the land in a measure, in a manner that was measurable to non-Native communities, if they didn't put up fences, if they didn't have fields that looked like rotational agriculture, then the land wasn't being improved, then they didn't have a right to it. None of this actually reconciles with a serious investigation of what mattered to Native communities when they encountered the early US Republic. Now, it might seem odd to end the slides here with an image of Samson Occam. It's this individual here. But I'm going to make an argument that he's really relevant to thinking about this. Occam was born in 1723, and he died in 1798. So his life literally spans the 18th century and all of these momentous transformations of the breakup of empire and birth of republic. And as a young man, Occam converted. So he's Mohegan from what today is neighboring Connecticut. You can go and visit the Mohegan Reservation and the Casino Mohegan Sun, as well as the Gladys Tantagwidja Museum, which is in Uncasville. And the Mohegans had been very successful in defending their sovereignty. Under the 17th century chief Uncas, the Mohegans had claimed protection under the Crown of England. So basically they were protected by the King of England from the incursions of colonists who were also his subjects. It was a brilliant strategy. And in the early 18th century, the Mohicans, who had a sort of messianic millenarian shaman tradition, were very attracted by the preaching style that came with the Great Awakening, with evangelical Christianity. And so Occam, among others, converts to Presbyterianism and becomes a Presbyterian minister after attending Eleazar Wheelock School. And Wheelock School becomes the foundation for Dartmouth College. Now in 1768, Samson Occam traveled to London in order to fundraise for mission efforts to other Native communities, which he was really invested in. And he was scandalized by what he found in the heart of empire. Because to him, London was a space that was rife with inequality and sadness, debtors' prisons, people drinking in the streets, children separated from their families, or worse yet, occupying a jail cell together because of debts that could not be paid. And so Occam became incredibly critical of the language that was being mobilized of civilization and improvement and uplift directed at Native peoples, when here at the heart of empire, this kind of bifurcation and hierarchy existed. When Occam returned, he wrote a short narrative of his life, which was so controversial it wasn't published until 1982. And it's really in that moment that he's outlining this critique of what he sees as the corruptions of English society, not of Presbyterianism, right? He's absolutely committed as a minister, but he feels that Christianity and Protestantism have lost their way. Occam began ministering first to the Mohicans, and then after he breaks with Eleazar Wheelock, moved to Long Island to minister to communities there. And in the wake of the American Revolution, now remember, after the Sullivan Campaign, a lot of Haudenosaunee communities have been fragmented, they're refugees, they're trying to rebuild. Occam was invited by Christians in Oneida territory in 1785 to come and become their new minister. And so Occam moves there and founds a community called Brothertown. And I think that name is incredibly significant because it encapsulates all of the values that Occam was trying to restore, based on his Presbyterianism, but also based on this kind of revitalization of Native culture in a moment of crisis. Brothertown was a refugee community. There were people from many different nations collected there. And Occam was trying to engage communal principles that would allow for everyone to be able to thrive and find their footing. Now, I've paired this image of Occam, so here's Occam, this is a contemporary 18th century engraving, with the current seal of the Oneida Nation. And I did this because the seal in some ways reiterates what the Haudenosaunee flag and the Hiawatha Belt have, which is the principle of Guyana-Jagoa, or the Great Peace Principle. Haudenosaunee tradition holds that a prophet named Diganawida came to rescue the five nations in a moment of crisis, when they were at war with one another, when they were experiencing starvation and dispossession, when there was constant upheaval and even cannibalism. This message was given to the Okweongwe, or the people. And when they heard Diganawida's message, they came to live together in a great house and transformed from the people into the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, living together in a community. During his travels, Diganawida, or the peacemaker, was assisted by speakers who brought converts to his mission. And it was in the acceptance of the peacemaker's message that the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas united. But central to Diganawida's notion and the great peace principle that he put forward was also this tree, whose roots, these four white roots, although it's a little hard to tell on this image, extended in the cardinal directions, to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west, and represented the fundamental notion of Haudenosaunee government, which was the possibility of inclusivity and extension of community to other nations. So when Occam goes to Brothertown in the 1780s, and the Haudenosaunee are picking up the pieces from the upheaval of the Revolution and the era of the Constitutional Convention, what they're actually engaging in is a radically different notion of politics and organization. They're looking at extending and allowing for refugees and nations that had not previously been part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to become part of that confederacy. They're not setting up a boundary, a hard barrier that defines who is a citizen and who is excluded. They're really trying to push for a much more inclusive model. To establish a longhouse, to gather nations around the tree of peace that embodied peace and strength and allowed for others to join. And so this seal here, that is, again, the seal of the contemporary Oneida Nation, I think really reflects a radically different concept of confederation, community, and belonging than is reflected in the final Constitution. So if we think about it in those terms, what we see is something that actually doesn't necessarily fit a Western tradition of republic, that isn't about exclusion. If you think about Plato's Republic, it was designed for a city-state. It was small. The ideal republic, as it expanded, would threaten the happiness of its residents by faction. The greater the population, the greater the percentage of faction in that population. It's one of the reasons why Federalists were so concerned about expanding the size of the republic. By contrast, the Haudenosaunee and other Native communities who had experienced tremendous upheaval in this foundation of the U.S. Republic began to think about ways that they could incorporate, adopt, and develop fictive kinship ties with communities that were not their own. So if we think about Indian influence in the Constitution, see it instead as an invitation to think about Indian philosophies and lifeways that Native communities to this day have used to maintain themselves and find a place of double consciousness as both being members of sovereign Native nations and members of the U.S. Republic, and that they too deserve a voice in our understanding of our expansion of rights, fundamental freedoms, and liberties. So thank you so much.
I think we're only using one, but I just want to say thank you. And who has questions? We'll start back here.
In considering the possible influence of the Confederacy on the Constitution, how united were the five nations in the Confederacy? Did they act as one in all issues, or did they maintain a certain amount of autonomy?
Yeah, that's a great question. That quotation that I drew from Cadwallader Colden when he says that each acts as an absolute republic, he's using that term in a very pointed way. Ideally, the Haudenosaunee had to take into account what would affect the Confederacy as a whole, but each nation could basically pursue its own policies. So in the American Revolution, the Mohawks overwhelmingly support the British. Joseph Brant, who's probably the most recognizable Mohawk leader, who was the brother-in-law of a former superintendent of Indian Affairs, Joseph Brant fights for the British against American colonists. On the other hand, you have Oneidas being led by Louis Cook, who are supporting the American patriots. And in those terms, one way to read that would be the Confederacy had the luxury of being able to basically hedge its bets and put people on both sides to guarantee that if the British won, they would be covered, and if the Americans won, they would be covered. And the Oneidas really initially used this. Oneida Territory and Occam moving to Oneida Territory becomes a refuge space for a lot of people who were dispossessed, Mohawks and Senecas alike. So there's no uniform policy. It's not like they have a single Secretary of State who is speaking for the Confederacy as a whole. That being said, there was a clear demarcation of the individuals who were authorized to speak for their nation, Cayugas or Mohawks, individuals who were authorized to speak for the whole nation. So Gonzadego in 1744 at Lancaster is holding a wampum belt that is the visual symbol of his authority to speak for the nations as a whole. So they would deploy it effectively to achieve their aims.
What tribe or band lived here and is now the paintings in library and in the post office and everything. What tribe or band lived here in Hyde Park, right where we stand?
So the territory today is claimed by the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. Lenape and Munsee communities existed throughout this region. They called the river that we now call the Hudson, they called the Mohicans, and were divided into different bands. So the Wappingers were part of the Lenape-Munsee Confederation. You had Lenapes down in Manhattan. Today, the Stockbridge-Munsee Nation has a representative located in, I believe, Troy, but in the early 19th century, they're removed to Wisconsin. So their tribal lands are currently in Wisconsin. And that's actually true for a lot of communities from New York. So the Oneidas, for instance, have roots in Wisconsin as well. Brothertown, which Occam founded, eventually moved to Wisconsin in the 1820s to go outside of the boundaries of the state. And so the question of who is reflected here and who's a community member is still a really fraught one.
Is there a time frame for this Decanawida figure? Is he more mythical or historical?
It depends on who you talk to. For Native scholars, Decanawida is potentially a historical figure who we don't have, how would I say this, Euro-American sources to prove the existence of. But in the Haudenosaunee oral tradition that has passed continuously, he is the person who helps to bring the Confederacy together around 3 centuries before you have the first incursions by European settler colonists. The principles that Decanawida puts forward become the organizing principles for all of the members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so in that sense, he's both a past presence and also a living contemporary presence. There's a sort of expectation that the community has to, the way that time circulates for Native communities is very different than European and Euro-American conceptions of time. So there's always a sense of responsibility to generations past and to future generations, all in the same continuous moment. So Decanawida is not necessarily an archive of the past or a person who, was a founder, but is a continuous presence with the notion of the Great Law of Peace.
Next question is back here.
I'm thoroughly impressed with what you've shared with us here tonight, and I'd like you to take that knowledge base and share with us what future do you see for the Native American Indian in our society?
Ooh, that's even harder than the opening question Sue gave me.
I mean, they're a great people, and they just seem like there's a deliberate effort to wipe them out. Based on all your research and what you've read and certain your interaction,
So,
keep them headed.
okay, the starting point for any kind of question like this is my specialty is in early modern Atlantic history, and in particular, I specialize in military history. You can't engage in that kind of work without being an optimist, because otherwise you'd just be too sad in the archives all the time. So people can change, histories can change, narratives can change, power structures change. One of the things that I think the public tends not to realize is that the Native American population has actually been growing in the census since 1980. It's actually not in decline, but that firsting and lasting narrative perpetuates this notion that Indians have disappeared. The largest Native community in the country is located 80 miles south of us in New York City. There are 80,000 people of Native descent from North America living in New York City. If you think about Central American and South American indigenous populations, that number is much, much higher. I also think that the changing of the media landscape has greatly transformed the public awareness of issues that impact Native communities. If you think about the protests that were organized around the Dakota Access Pipeline 2 years ago, and the ways in which the hashtag #NoDAPL and water protectors circulated so quickly, and the ways in which this was made both a national and an international issue, that's simply a kind of exposure that wasn't available previously. On the other hand, as I said, a lot of communities currently are facing the possibility of detribalization, removal of their lands. In 2005, the Oneida Nation brought a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it had to do with Oneida jurisdiction. So the Oneidas in the 19th century lose most of their territorial lands, even though they were guaranteed by a treaty with the United States. And by the mid-1800s, most of that land is gone. By the 1930s, they're down to, I think, it's 5 or 10 acres. It's really small. And the Oneidas invested in a series of mini-marts along the highways in western New York, and basically were able to bring funds that allowed them to repurchase lands. And so by 2005, they had repurchased a significant amount of land in the region around Syracuse. But there was a jurisdictional issue about places like the city of Sherrill. Who was going to be the tax collector? Would it be the Oneida Nation, or would it be the New York County in which this was located? This case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled against the Oneidas. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a beloved figure among the progressive left, wrote the majority opinion basically saying, well, why didn't you protest dispossession in the 1830s? As a historian, given that Andrew Jackson was president in the 1830s, that would not seem the most reasonable time to press your case, but, you know, history is as it, and I think that was very much informed by the ways in which people assume Native communities always had resources available to them. So I think that the strategies of resistance have changed, and that there are possibilities for Native communities, but there's also a tremendous amount of threat still. Sure. You have a question down there. Where? Middle pew.
I'm curious about the difficulties as a researcher that you must encounter trying to deal with a culture whose tradition is primarily oral. And you did show one document up there that I'm not sure what language.
Thanks.
Maybe stand up.
I can hear you, and if needed, I can repeat.
It's okay. But I'm curious about what kind of written documents do you deal with in researching this? What are your sources?
So, Randy, would you mind scrolling down to that first slide that I had? This one. That's it. Perfect. So, you are correct that if we look at a textual record, not only do we have very few sources from the 17th and 18th century written by Native peoples themselves. In the 19th century, this changes. As I mentioned, the Cherokees, for instance, write their own constitution, and under the leadership of George Guess or Sequoyah, they actually come up with their own syllabary, with their own language. It's the single most effective literacy tool in world history. In 3 years, the Cherokee Nation goes from having 0% literacy in its language to 97% literacy. But for the 17th and 18th century, you find very few texts written by Native peoples. On the other hand, and the reason I asked for this slide to be put back up, there are sources. They're just not sources that people have traditionally thought of as sources. Wampum belts, baskets, weavings, paintings, material culture, archaeological evidence, are all sources that allow for us to reconstruct Native perspectives. Oral histories taken with knowledge keepers in communities, with tribal historic officers, oftentimes have a wealth of material that has simply been overlooked by other researchers. Interestingly enough, 19th century researchers like Henry Louis Morgan were engaged in exactly this kind of work, talking to people like the Parker family to get a sense of the stories of Seneca traditions, but also how the Senecas had experienced things like the American Revolution, the early Republic. And researchers today often see those types of sources as tainted because they come out of a 19th century mindset, when in fact, if used with care, they're really useful. A lot of European authored sources also are a goldmine of information. Many, for instance, when I was writing my first book, and I was looking at soldiers' journals of people traversing the space, where General Edward Braddock was defeated in 1755, a lot of soldiers' journals made comments about markings on trees that had been made by passing native groups, Odawas and Abenakis, that demonstrated the military prowess of these communities. So there's a record of something that was on a tree that hasn't survived 2 centuries, but is recorded by these eyewitness accounts. It just means combing through material and being really broad-minded about what kind of material you have to approach in order to write these types of histories. Relying on texts alone is only going to give you one perspective on that. So I think that local histories are really important. Local historical societies, we're very lucky in New York that we actually have county historians, which is something that I wish every state in the Union funded, because county historians, local historical societies, community record offices that half the time are, somebody's basement with a file cabinet in it, actually have a tremendous amount of material that isn't in places like the National Archives and Records Administration, that isn't in the New York Historical Society. Most of those archives were built by interested parties in the 19th century to showcase their ancestors. So every Boston Brahmin donated papers to the Massachusetts Historical Society because that sort of cemented the place of Massachusetts in the founding narrative. So you just have to look beyond that. But it's a lot of legwork. Yeah.
Hang on, John.
The famous artist, whose name escapes me, has his murals are in the post office.
Olin Dow's?
Huh?
Olin Dow's?
Olin Dow's, and in Rhinebeck too. And the famous one I like is the Indian is on the hill right over here, around the corner, and he's looking down into where the pier is now, and where the boathouse is, and where the railroad station is, and he's saying, "What the heck is this?" Because it's a ship, and they're unloading, and they're provisioning, of English. And then the same thing. There was another famous painting that's in the library of apparently a battle or a destruction campaign burning the Indians out of Hyde Park, and they're all, lying on the ground being treated, while their housing is their huts, the round houses are being burned in the background.
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting about Dow's and sort of the artists of the Works Progress Administration is that a lot of them either intentionally or more often unintentionally reinforce that firsting and lasting. And in part, it's because Franklin Roosevelt was very proud of the Dutch past of his family, was very proud of the kind of settler colonial tradition, and really showcasing the kind of up by your bootstraps. It's very compelling in the Depression to kind of show what you can do with little. But what that did was it reinforced the idea of Indians as giving way to progress. I think that's another thing. We often assume Native peoples are somehow allergic to technology. So, if a Native community wants to have a hunting permit, for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit community wanted to hunt whales, and environmentalists said, well, you can do that, but only if you used bone-tipped harpoons, because that's what your people used. And they're like, well, it's the 21st century, and we hunt a little bit differently now. So Dow's and the others, in creating these murals, both captured the kind of international encounters in places like the Hudson Valley, but again reinforced that notion that Indians were gone. And a lot of the blue and gold signs that you see around New York State that come up in the 1930s are very much on that topic of firsting and lasting. This is the last place that Indians were before they were removed or before they disappeared. This is the first house that was built by, a Livingston, or this is the first site of a post office. So it's a really mixed legacy.
Actually, it's not a question, it's a clarification. The previous person who asked the question talked about a picture in the post office mural that he interpreted as Indians being burned out of their houses. That was actually blacks and African Americans, I believe on the site of Guineatown in Hackett Hill Park, but I'm not sure. And it was not somebody being burned out of somebody, it was a fire. And sort of the point of the picture in the post office is that the white people are ministering to the African Americans. There are no Indians involved in that.
I'm going to have to come back to the Hyde Park Post Office. I admit, I live in Rhinebeck, so I'm used to the Rhinebeck murals. But that's excellent to know.
Can you address the passport issue for Native Americans?
The passport, like, you mean for Iroquois Nation?
Yeah, I mean, where do they?
Oh, yeah. So this is a really interesting question. So as you may or may not know, the Iroquois Nationals, who are the lacrosse team of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, are excellent lacrosse players, and there have been a couple of controversies in the recent past where they've tried to travel on Haudenosaunee passports, and the U.S. and Canada will not allow them to go overseas. And in the most recent instance, the United Kingdom, which for some inexplicable reason was hosting the Lacrosse World Championships, would not accept the passport as entry. And what's interesting is if you actually talk to people who come from reservations that straddle the border between New York and Canada, like Aguasasne, one of the things that community members say is, on the American side, American Border Patrol and Customs officers find the passports to be really cute. Like, oh, you've got an Indian passport, that's amazing. Can I take a picture? Can I take a selfie? And they just think that this is sort of an adorable feature of Indian culture. Whereas on the Canadian side, they've built a world-class surveillance and border patrol facility, and they will literally remove passports from people who try to cross with that. And I find that fascinating because the kind of narrative that circulates in the United States is that U.S. Americans were really awful to Native peoples. We were and are. But that somehow Canadians are better. That they have, because you have Nunavut territory, because indigenous languages are recognized, that somehow this has led to a sort of warm and fuzzy engagement with Native peoples. And the passport issue has actually exposed that is not at all the case. The Canadian government sees a very real threat to its sovereignty by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy issuing independent passports, and they've done everything that they can to prevent that from really being enacted.
Are there any other questions? Going once? Yeah. Going twice? Sold.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I have a little something for you. Thank you so much.
I hope that was what you want.
Oh, that's great. Great. I think, just before they start going away, before you get up, hold on, please. I think that we've had a lot to think about. I think for most of you, this is a pretty new piece of information, so hopefully we'll learn a little bit more later on. So thank you so much to Professor Crouch for a very interesting and stimulating conversation. I have a few people to thank, as usual. John and Gloria Golden, who are not here tonight, but they're my co-chairs and help me pull these things together. Randy Soden and Grant Ferris are helping with the AV tonight. And also John Bickford has been helping us all along. This is his last night because he's moving to Maryland. So thank you all, John. Herb Sweet is taping this so that any of your friends who were not able to come tonight, you can find it on the website for the church, and the address is in the back of your program. And Joanne Lown is coordinating our reception, which we hope that you all will stay for. Couple of announcements in your program. I don't want to spend too much time, but our next chat is April 4th, and it will be talking about FDR and the Holocaust, so that should be very stimulating as well. There are two things mentioned, events that you might be interested in. The Mother's Day Tea, which is really filling up quickly. So if you're interested, please call the number that's there. And then also, I don't know if any of you know, but we've had a problem with our furnace at the church, which led to a mold problem. So we haven't been in the church since the beginning of the year. So we have been doing some fundraising for that. So this next event that's listed here is a concert. The Hyde Park Chamber Ensemble, Russell Urban Mead, who I think is here tonight, is one of the players, and they're doing that as a fundraiser to help us pay for our new furnace. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. If you can stay, please join us for some refreshments. So thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Sue, you thanked everybody but yourself. Thank you.